The first rule of Amish marriage was never written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way women moved through their kitchens, in the angle of a mother-in-law's shoulders at a Sunday table, in the particular silence that fell over a room when a young wife spoke one word too many. I learned this rule before I learned it had a name. I learned it the way most Amish girls learn the things that matter most. Not from a book, not from a sermon, not from anyone who looked directly at my face when they said it. I learned it in pieces, in whispers, in the careful language of women who had already survived what I was just beginning to walk into. And by the time I understood what the rule actually was, it had already done what it was designed to do. It had already broken something in me that I am still, years later, trying to piece back together. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where the stories that were never supposed to leave the kitchen finally get spoken out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in a farming community in Ohio where the rules were older than anyone living could remember, and where the women who kept them were called blessed. I married at 19 and I left at 26. And in the 7 years between those two facts, there is a story that I have been circling for a long time without being able to say it plain. Today, I am going to say it plain. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have never subscribed to this channel. And I understand that, I do. But I want to ask you something honestly. If you have ever sat in a room full of people and felt completely alone inside a life that looked perfectly fine from the outside, then what I am about to tell you is going to reach something in you that most things don't. So before we go any further, please subscribe. It's free, it keeps these stories alive. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, did you ever follow a rule you didn't understand because the cost of questioning it felt too high? Because I did. Every single day for 7 years. We married in October. I want you to hold that detail because it matters. October in Ohio Amish country means the harvest is nearly done, the canning is finished, the work of summer has emptied you in that particular way that feels like accomplishment on the surface and exhaustion all the way down to the bone underneath. Jonas and I had known each other the way young people in our community knew each other, across fence lines and church benches, and the careful distance that unmarried men and women were expected to keep. He was 23. He had his father's farm promised to him eventually, and his mother's silence about everything that mattered. Everyone said he was steady. Everyone said I was fortunate. I believed them because I had been raised to believe the people who said such things, and because I had no other information to work with, and because the wanting to believe it was strong enough to fill in whatever gaps the evidence left open. The wedding was on a Tuesday. 300 people. My mother's best tablecloths, roast chicken, and 7 kinds of pie. By the time the last buggy rolled down the lane, it was past 10 at night, and I had been awake for 20 hours. And the dress I had sewn myself over the course of 3 months was damp at the back from a long day of standing and serving and smiling at people who kept telling me how blessed I was. Jonas and I drove home in the dark in his father's buggy, and the horse knew the road, and neither of us said very much at all. I want to tell you that the silence felt peaceful. I want to tell you that. But I had already begun, without knowing it, to learn the difference between a peaceful silence and a silence that had weight to it. And that night in the buggy, with the fields dark on either side of us and the horse's breath making small clouds in the October air, I felt for the first time a silence that had weight. The marriage rule I did not yet know existed showed itself for the first time 3 weeks after the wedding. I had spent the day helping Jonas's mother put up the last of her apple butter, 11 quarts, standing over a copper kettle in her kitchen from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. I came home and made supper. I washed the dishes. I swept the floor. I nursed the tiredness that had settled into my lower back like something permanent. And that night, when Jonas reached for me in the dark, I turned toward him and I said, very quietly, that I was exhausted and could we please just sleep. He said nothing. He simply lay still for a moment and then turned onto his side facing the wall. And that was the end of it, I thought. That was the end of it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of the house settling, and I thought, we are fine. This is fine. Tired wives say this to their husbands, and the husbands understand. And in the morning, everything is the same as before. I believed that for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, I began to understand that something had shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing in our community ever shifted dramatically. It was small things. The way Jonas answered my questions with the minimum number of words. The way he looked slightly past my shoulder when I spoke to him at supper. The way the warmth that had been thin to begin with got a little thinner, like a fire that no one was quite feeding. And I felt, for the first time, the particular Amish wife panic that I would come to know very well over the following years. The panic that says, something is wrong and you do not know exactly what. And you cannot ask directly, because asking directly is also somehow wrong. I want to stop here and tell you something that I did not understand until years after I left. What I was feeling in those first weeks was not unusual. It was not a flaw in my marriage or in Jonas specifically. It was the system working exactly the way it was designed to work. And the system had a rule at the center of it that nobody ever stated out loud in those words because it didn't need to be stated out loud. It was absorbed. It was breathed in like air. The rule was this: a wife's body belongs to the marriage, not to herself, to the marriage. And the marriage, in our community, meant the husband. And the husband's needs were spiritual needs, not just physical ones, because the theology said so, because the bishop preached it, because the old women repeated it in careful sideways sentences over coffee in farmhouse kitchens across the county. I was raised inside this theology the way a fish is raised inside water. You don't notice the water. You don't notice you can't breathe anything else. You only begin to notice when someone lifts you out and you realize with your whole body what you have been surrounded by all along. My mother-in-law came the 2nd week of November. She came with a loaf of bread she had baked that morning, and she sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for an hour about nothing in particular. And then, right before she stood to leave, she said something that I have turned over in my hands 10,000 times since. She said, "A new marriage is like a new fire, Martha. You have to keep feeding it or it goes out. And cold houses are no good for anyone." She smiled when she said it. The smile was gentle and entirely without malice. I smiled back. I said I understood. She picked up her coat and left. I stood at my kitchen window for a long time after her buggy disappeared down the road, and I felt the architecture of what had just happened settle around me. She had not threatened me. She had not criticized me. She had delivered a message wrapped so carefully in warmth that refusing it felt like refusing warmth itself. That was the first time I consciously understood that I was not dealing with a person making a choice. I was dealing with a system sending a message. And the system had more messengers than I had yet met. Now, here is the part that most people on the outside find the hardest to understand. The messengers were not cruel. That is the thing that doesn't fit into any easy story. Jonas's mother was a woman who had built her whole life around the community that was now delivering this message through her mouth. And she believed in that community the way she believed in Scripture. And she was not wrong to love the things she loved, even if the thing she loved had a cost that fell entirely on the women. The women who came to my kitchen in those early months of marriage, with their bread and their coffee and their careful sideways wisdom, were not villains. They were women who had survived. They were women who had learned, in the specific way Amish women learn things, how to live inside a framework that did not bend. And they were passing on that survival, wrapping it in love because love was the only container they had. I am not angry at them. I want you to understand that. I am not angry at them. I am angry at the water. I am angry at the thing that taught all of us we were fish who had no business wanting air. By December, I was pregnant. By March of the following year, I understood the marriage rule in full. Not because anyone explained it, because I had tried twice more to say that I was tired, that I was sick, that my body was not mine to give that particular night. And both times, the silence came back harder than before. And both times, the temperature of the house dropped a few degrees more. And both times, the visits from the women on his side of the family got a little more pointed without ever once being unkind. There was a woman in our district named Ruth, older, maybe 60, with hands that looked like they had spent 60 years doing exactly what they were supposed to do. She sat beside me at a quilting in February, and she spoke to me without looking at me, the way Amish women always deliver the truest things. And she said, "Martha, I am going to tell you something that my own mother told me, and that her mother told her, and that goes back further than any of us can trace. In this life, there are doors that only open from one side. You did not build the door, but you are standing in front of it, and understanding which side you are on is not weakness. It is wisdom." I kept sewing. She kept sewing. Neither of us looked at the other. And I understood that she had just handed me something, and that what she had handed me was not comfort exactly, but something more durable than comfort. She had handed me the truth about the room I was in. And even though the truth was not a way out, not yet, it was something to hold on to. It was proof that I was not imagining it, that the room was real, that the walls were real, that other women had stood where I was standing and had felt the exact same shape of the walls with their hands in the dark. I spent the first year of my marriage learning to read the weather of my husband's silence the way my father had taught me to read the actual sky before a storm. A certain stillness in his jaw at supper meant I needed to be softer that evening. A particular way of setting down his coffee cup meant something had gone wrong in his day, and the night ahead would require more from me than I had. I became a student of his moods, the way I had once been a student of scripture, with the same discipline, the same attentiveness, the same understanding that getting it wrong had consequences. And somewhere inside that first year, without any single moment I could point to, the girl who had married Jonas in October in her handmade dress became someone slightly different. Not broken in any visible way, still functioning, still canning and cooking and keeping house and growing a baby and showing up at church with her hair pinned correctly, but hollowed slightly. The way a tree can look perfectly solid from the outside and have something eaten through its center that you only discover when it finally falls. What I want you to understand, and this is the thing I need you to stay with me for because it is the most important thing I know how to say, is that I was not a weak woman. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story that the outside world sometimes tells is the version where the Amish woman is passive, helpless, waiting to be rescued by the modern world. That is not my story. I was not passive. I was calculating, constantly, the cost of every refusal against the cost of compliance, the way anyone calculates when the consequences are real and the resources are limited. I had no money that was mine. I had a baby, and then another baby, and then the one I was carrying. I had a community that was my entire world, every friendship, every family tie, every face I had known since before I could read. The cost of saying no was not abstract. It was losing all of that. And the cost of saying yes was something that did not have a name in Pennsylvania Dutch, something that accumulated slowly in a place no one else could see, something I did not have language for until years later, when a therapist in a yellow office outside Columbus handed me words, one at a time, like she was feeding something that had been starving for a long time. Coercive control, she said. Marital coercion. Consent shaped by consequence. I wrote those words in a notebook, and I looked at them for a long time. And I thought about Ruth and her quilting needle moving in and out of the fabric without pausing, and the particular bravery it takes to hand someone the truth about a room. When you yourself have learned to live in it so long, you have forgotten what air tastes like outside of it. I left at 26. That is a different story for a different video, as I always say. But I will tell you this much. When I left, the shunning was swift and complete, and exactly as structured as everything else in that community. My mother stopped writing. My sisters found reasons to be busy. The women who had sat at my kitchen table and drunk my coffee and handed me their sideways wisdom went quiet, in the particular way that communities go quiet when one of their own breaks the line. I am not going to tell you it didn't hurt. I am going to tell you that it hurt in a way I had no preparation for, even though I had known it was coming. Because knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are entirely different experiences, and no amount of understanding the system protects you from the weight of the moment when the system closes behind you, like water closing over a place where something used to be. But here is what I want to leave you with, and I need you to hear this clearly. The marriage rule that broke me before my first anniversary was not Jonas. It was not his mother. It was not Ruth or the quilting women or the bishop or the theology that built the framework they all moved inside of. The rule that broke me was the one that said my exhaustion was spiritual failure. The rule that said my body was a marital resource. The rule that said a wife's no was not a complete sentence, but the beginning of a problem that the community would then be required to solve. That rule is very old. That rule exists in many communities under many different names, dressed in many different kinds of theology and tradition and cultural expectation. And if you grew up inside a version of that rule, whatever community it came from, whatever language it spoke, I see you. You were not failing. You were surviving inside a structure that was designed to make compliance feel like choice. And the fact that you survived it, the fact that you are here watching this, the fact that you are still curious enough and brave enough to look at hard things directly, that is not nothing. That is the beginning of something. That is exactly the kind of small fire that does not go out. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this. I know there are 1,000 other places you could have been tonight, and you chose to spend this time here, with this story, with Martha, and with every woman whose truth lives somewhere inside it. I noticed something recently that stays with me. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. And if this story reached something in you, if it named something you have carried a long time without having the words for it, I hope you will subscribe before you go. It is free, and it is how these stories keep getting told. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, was there a rule in your life, spoken or unspoken, that you followed for years before you understood what it was really asking of you? I would truly love to read what you write. Until next time. Your exhaustion was never a door for the devil. It was just exhaustion, and you were allowed to be tired. You always were.